episode, we are dialing it in, bringing you 5 takeaways on a very important piece of legislation. It is the one we have been waiting for, the 2027 Medicare Advantage and Part D Final Rule, published by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, our friends at CMS. First up, and we mentioned this in our coverage of the proposed rule back in December, CMS codified the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act changes to Medicare Part D. Since that legislation was passed in 2022, CMS has been including yearly updates in both the proposed and final rules. They've now codified the changes into the Federal Register, so they no longer have to do that. That means that the elimination of the Part D coverage gap, or donut hole, the reduced annual out-of-pocket threshold, removal of catastrophic phase cost sharing, replacement of the coverage gap discount program with the manufacturer discount program, implementation of the selected drug subsidy, removal of initial coverage phase language, updates to true out-of-pocket cost calculations, specialty tier rules, reinsurance payment methodologies, all of those Part D provisions passed via the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022 are now codified into law. Second on our list, let's talk about special supplemental benefits for the chronically ill. SSBCI is how CMS shortens this designation. And we've got a couple changes here. We'll start with debit cards meant to be used to pay for those special supplemental benefits. When an MA organization provides debit cards as part of their benefits package, they must, quote, provide debit cards that are electronically linked to plan-covered benefits through a real-time identification mechanism to verify eligibility of plan-covered benefits at the point of sale, end quote. In other words, at the point of sale, the debit card must be able to evaluate the purchase to determine whether or not it qualifies as a covered benefit under the plan. CMS does not specify how plans should go about this point-of-service real-time mechanism, as they call it, only that it must happen or the MA organization will be breaking CMS rules. Couple more important notes about SSBCI and debit cards. MA plans must explain to beneficiaries how to use the debit card to access supplemental benefits. That includes using the debit card in general, and also how to utilize their benefits if they have a debit card, but the network supporting that card goes down. There's also required disclosure of what is and isn't covered by the debit cards, quote, including applicable conditions and limitations, eligible over-the-counter items, and benefits accessible through debit cards, end quote. And then while we're on the topic of special supplemental benefits for the chronically ill, I want to make sure I mention the regulations on hemp and cannabis, mainly because CMS came out and stated their position on the matter. So one of the first things mentioned about SSBCI is the CMS definition that these products, quote, must have a reasonable expectation of improving or maintaining the health or overall function of a chronically ill enrollee, end quote. CMS further comments, and I'm quoting here as well, cannabis products that are illegal under applicable state or federal law, including the FFDCA, are not allowable as SSBCI. Current regulations prohibit all cannabis products from being offered as SSBCI. Any cannabis product with a Delta-9 THC content above the 0.3 threshold is still considered marijuana, remains a Schedule I controlled substance, and therefore is illegal under federal law and would be subject to CMS's prohibition. More specifically, the CMS definition of hemp excludes, quote, any cannabinoids that are not naturally found or produced in the cannabis plant, cannabinoids that are synthesized outside of the plant, and final form products for human use that contain more than 0.4 milligrams per container combined total of naturally occurring tetrahydrocannabinols and other naturally produced cannabinoids determined by the Secretary of Health and Human Services to have the same effect, end quote. So basically what CMS is saying here is that they are drawing a line in the sand as far as what they consider to be hemp and what they consider to be marijuana. Back at the end of 2025, CMS passed legislation reversing the Farm Bill provision of 2018, which offered a broader definition of hemp. CMS has essentially really narrowed what can be considered hemp and legally sold as such. The new definition of hemp will go into effect on November 12th, 2026, and CMS has defined those products to be hulled hemp seed protein powder, and hemp seed oil that are considered GRAS, or generally recognized as safe by the FDA. Interestingly enough, the prescription drug Epidiolex is one that meets the criteria of the 2018 definition of hemp, but will not meet the new definition, and under Medicare Part D, will not be able to be offered as a Part C supplemental benefit. And that is because Medicare is a federal program. CMS has defined that particular product to be considered marijuana under the new legislation. And if it is considered as such, CMS says it's an illegal substance under federal law. But as far as the three categories CMS has deemed as safe, those are also recognized by the FDA. So MA organizations can offer those as SSBCI to enrollees who qualify. CMS does mention that coverage of hemp and marijuana products under insurance is very new, but they also mention it's really not up to them to decide on the legality of the product. That's already been decided by both the DEA and the FDA. So essentially, this is CMS saying that they are staying in their lane and they're just upholding the law surrounding a particular product. Super interesting, but there's more to cover in this final rule. So let's keep moving. Our third item, and a super short mention here on the new special enrollment period that isn't. CMS proposed a new special enrollment period for enrollees to, quote, change plans when one or more of their providers are leaving their plan's network, end quote. CMS has not moved forward with the new SEP. Instead, they will continue to monitor the market, and this SEP will remain only available after both the MA organization and CMS have decided that the plan change is significant enough to warrant one. Our fourth takeaway from the final rule. Let's talk TPMO disclaimers. The TPMO disclaimer that needs to be made within the first minute of a sales call is awkward. Can I just say that? Awkward and necessary until now. Thankfully, CMS has heard what agents have been saying about the placement of this disclaimer. Couple of things they mentioned that they had heard from agents, and I think are important to highlight here. They've acknowledged that saying the disclaimer at the beginning of the conversation isn't really natural. In fact, it can be confusing and off-putting. CMS has heard that the first moments of a phone call are trying to get demographic information, as well as determining if the individual has a valid election period. With these considerations in mind, CMS has decided that agents don't need to read the disclaimer within the first minute of a call, but they are required to read it, quote, prior to the discussion of any benefits during the call, end quote. And this disclaimer change is only for sales calls because, again, it's awkward to try to get that disclaimer out in the first minute of a phone call. It's confusing for the beneficiary, and it doesn't make for a natural conversation. But you do have to mention the disclaimer prior to talking benefits, which, in all honesty, should make working the disclaimer into natural conversation much easier. But again, only for sales calls. The disclaimer must still be present when communicating with Medicare beneficiaries via email, online chat, or other electronic communications. It must still be prominently displayed on your website, and it must still be included on printed marketing materials and TV ads. Another change to the TPMO disclaimers, and this applies to all disclaimers, and I'm so thankful CMS has addressed this. The reference to the State Health Insurance Assistance Program, or SHIP for short. This is a tough one to make sound natural within the disclaimer, and that is coming from someone who talks for a living. CMS has heard the arguments that enrollee experience with SHIP varies depending on the state and who they end up talking to. An enrollee might get a particularly knowledgeable and helpful individual during one call, and the next time, the person on the other end might not have as much experience or knowledge. CMS believes the user experience is better when a Medicare beneficiary can get consistent help from a knowledgeable source. So that means that the SHIP reference is out, but the reference to 1-800-Medicare and Medicare.gov will stay. That would shorten the current disclaimer for TPMOs that do not sell all MA or Part D plans within a service area to: we do not offer every plan available in your area. Currently, we represent X number of organizations which offer X number of products in your area. Please contact Medicare.gov or 1-800-Medicare to get info on all of your options. And then if you do offer all the plans in your service area, just lose that first sentence of the disclaimer. And don't worry, these rules only go into effect within 60 days of appearing in the Federal Register, so you'll have time to get a handle on those disclaimers. And now for our fifth and final highlight from the 2027 CMS final rule, the removal of the cooling off periods. When it comes to protecting seniors from potential fraud and abuse, I think we can all agree that CMS has always had great intentions in mind. At least that is the way that I look at it. I can see what they're trying to do, how they're trying to protect the Medicare beneficiary population. And I think sometimes that means they go super strict when they're trying to enforce a particular rule or curtail a certain type of behavior. We have seen that on both sides of the aisle, for sure. And then also, with the change of the administration, this CMS is trying to be a little more hands-off, only stepping in where they feel they need to and where the law says they have the authority to do so. Little bit of a different interpretation compared to the previous administration. And that means that the 48-hour scope of appointment is no longer a thing. It has been eliminated. CMS acknowledged that this cooling off period often created an experience that was not ideal for an individual seeking insurance coverage or the agent. So, no more need to wait 48 hours between SOA signing and the appointment. You'll still need to get the scope. We're just getting rid of the cooling off period. When the changes in the final rule go into effect, an SOA will be required regardless of who initiates contact. If it's the plan, agent, or broker initiating contact, an SOA is required. If it's the beneficiary initiating contact, whether that's a walk-in, an unscheduled call, web-based chat, or a web-based form, an SOA is required. If the appointment is an in-person personal marketing appointment, the SOA must be in writing. If the appointment is not in person, audio or audiovisual recording or an electronic record is acceptable. CMS also clarified that business reply cards, voicemails, online forms, or other requests for information that include the type of products to be discussed are in effect SOAs. Another cooling off period that will be eliminated, the 12-hour wait between holding an educational event and a sales event. We're going back to the rule that individuals must be allowed to leave if they don't wish to attend the sales event, but you can hold those events back to back and keep the momentum going if the potential enrollee wishes to essentially continue the conversation. Couple more notes I want to mention about the scope of appointment. They are good for 12 months following the date the beneficiary signs their name. Just keep in mind that a new product year requires a new scope of appointment. So say you enroll someone in March because they're turning 65. When you talk to them during AEP 7 months later about plans for the next coverage year, you'll need to get them to sign a new scope of appointment. Now, it's time for my disclaimer that these are not the only things worth noting in the final rule. They are just my initial takeaways for agents. I actually had a fun time going down the rabbit hole of star ratings changes. Took a look at the measures that are being removed from those calculations. And then the Part C depression screening and follow-up that's being added into the star ratings calculations, which great to see behavioral health continue to gain momentum as a standard rather than an add-on. Still work to do, but we are making progress. In other CMS news, on Monday, April 6th, we got the official CMS 2027 rate announcement for MA and Part D. Thankfully, the overall expected change has increased from that almost flat 0.09% in the advance notice, coming up to 2.48% in the final rate announcement. Still not a great number, but better than it was. We will go further into that information likely in next week's Friday 5. We will go further into that information in another episode. So if you have questions you'd like us to answer about the rate announcement or provisions in the final rule, reach out and let us know. ASG Podcast at ritterim.com. And you can also send in your shout outs for birthdays, work anniversaries, celebrating your first contract, or milestones in your career. We would love to recognize your achievements here on the show. That's all we've got for this installment of the Agent Survival Guide podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next episode. The Agent Survival Guide podcast is a production of Ritter Insurance Marketing, an integrity company. This episode was written and produced by me, Sarah Ruppel. Script editing and fact check by Emily Ryan. Podcast design by Urban Rivera. Like what you hear? Follow along with our show wherever you get your podcasts.